Her fingers grazed his beard, the ridged texture of her midnight blue scales rasping softly against his skin, and Rin forgot how to breathe. They were alone in a dim corridor that reeked of stale metal and something faintly sulfuric, evidence of the starship's failing air filters. Xerxes' golden gaze flickered with an alien luminescence, pupils expanding like an eclipse devouring a sun. He felt the quiver in her hand even as she maintained that impossible touch, as if his coarse human hair were a relic she could hardly comprehend. Then, with an audible gasp, she seized the collar of his flight jacket, yanked him closer, and practically dragged him into the nearest utility room, slamming the door behind them with a hiss of pressurized air. In the half-lit gloom, her breath surged against his face, hot with urgency and confusion. They stood chest to chest, the hush of cramped silence swallowing them both. He'd never been this close to her before. Barely half an arm's length separated them, if that. The sterile walls hummed with the labor of engines overhead, the floor quivering under the strain of sublight travel. Even with the tension thrumming around them, Rin couldn't look away from her. There was something so raw about her expression. She looked simultaneously enthralled and terrified, as if she couldn't decide whether to push him against the wall or flee. He tried to steady his breathing, but found it near impossible. Somehow, she'd stripped the air from his lungs. Words fluttered around in his head, none of them coherent enough to speak. He recalled the moment he'd first seen her a week ago, stepping onto the battered starship that ferried wandering souls across the outer fringe. She'd sat silently at the back, hooded cloak drawn tight around a form that hinted at sharp angles and coiling muscle. Now that he had the privilege of seeing her uncovered, he realized that her features were far more delicate than he'd expected, with softly tapered cheekbones and lips tinted a faint lavender against her obsidian skin. Her long lashes framed those brilliant eyes, and a single braided tendril of silver hair brushed the slope of her forehead, shimmering with an otherworldly glow under the overhead light. She exhaled, the tension trembling in the arch of her shoulders. "I'm sorry," she whispered in a voice that resonated in the pit of Rin's stomach, soft yet edgy. "I have never felt this before." Rin swallowed. His heart pounded like the engine's thrusters, threatening to tear out of his chest. "Felt what?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she lifted her fingers again, brushing them across his jawline. He suppressed a shudder at the unfamiliar sensation of scale on skin, smooth yet ridged in a pattern that teased every nerve ending. "I've touched human hair before," she murmured, though her accent twisted the words into something exotic. "In the markets. In the labs. But never like this. You're so alive." He dared a nervous smile. "Is that a compliment?" "It's a danger," she said quietly, her eyes flicking up to his. "I should keep my distance." Her sudden shift in mood rattled him. He searched her face for any clue, but the faint glow behind her pupils revealed only her own bewilderment. "Then why did you pull me in here?" She let out a shaky exhale, her lips parting. Her posture stiffened as she weighed her next words. "Because if I didn't, I might have done something foolish in that corridor. Something exposed." He felt his pulse spike at the unspoken suggestion. But a part of him recognized there was more beneath these surface sparks. This wasn't just about physical impulse. She was unsettled, perhaps even afraid. "What's your name?" he asked, though he knew it from the passenger manifest. He wanted to hear her say it, to anchor themselves in something normal. "Xerxa." She rolled the R like a purr of electricity. "And you're in." Her knowledge of his name gave him a small thrill. "I haven't seen you leave your bunk much. I figured you'd slip away once the ship docked." She averted her gaze, a fleeting look of guilt in those gleaming eyes. "I'm traveling in secret. I don't stay anywhere too long. It's safer that way." He wanted to press her, to dig into the underpinnings of that statement. But everything about her posture screamed that she was a coiled wire waiting to snap. Her confession had pinned him with curiosity, though. "Safer from what?" She flinched at the question, those slender shoulders tightening. Then, perhaps compelled by an inexplicable trust, or maybe an equally inexplicable desire, she drew a small device from beneath her fitted tunic. It was the size of a coin, etched with swirling glyphs that glowed faintly green. "This is a subspace locator," she said. "If I stay in one place too long, they'll find me." Rin's eyes flicked between the device and her face. "Who's they?" Her lips pressed together, tension flickering in her throat. "They keep my people in captivity. My planet, my entire race has been exploited for the healing properties in our blood. I escaped. That's all you need to know." A silent hush settled over them. Rin felt a swirl of emotions: pity, anger, protectiveness. He clenched his jaw, remembering rumors that in the far reaches of the galaxy, unscrupulous corporations or slavers targeted the exotic. "I won't tell anyone," he offered. "You're safe with me." She stared at him for a long moment, eyes flicking across his features as if assessing the sincerity of his words. "I felt you were different," she whispered. "But I didn't expect it to be this overwhelming. Her free hand flexed at her side, uncertain. "I don't know if you can help me, but a part of me wants to trust you. To trust this." Her palm brushed his cheek again, slower this time, savoring the texture. A wave of heat coursed through Rin. He placed his hand over hers gently, letting her feel the rough calluses on his fingertips. "Trust doesn't come easy in these parts," he said softly. "But we can figure it out together." Her expression shifted, a flicker of reluctant hope swirling with that undeniable physical pull. She took a half-step closer, her breath ghosting over his lips. For an electrifying second, he thought she might kiss him. His senses drank in the faint tang of alien spice on her skin, the way the ridges on her temples shimmered with each quickened pulse. But her eyes snapped wide, and she stiffened as if jolted by a sudden realization. "We need to get out of here," she said, voice quavering. "Staying on this ship is too big a risk." Rin's heart was still in his throat. "All right. We'll figure out a plan. But we need to blend in until we can disembark at the next station. That's only 2 days away." She swallowed, her gaze flicking to the door as if expecting enemies to barge in any second. "They'll be scanning passenger rosters. If they even suspect me, they'll send someone." He caught the shift in her stance, the way her weight balanced on the balls of her feet, ready to spring. She was a fighter, or at the very least someone used to living in a constant state of escape. Adrenaline tingled through his veins. "Let me check if you're on the official roster," he said. "I used to help manage the station's data logs. I have a friend who owes me a favor. Maybe we can erase your name." She studied him, a spark of caution dimming the earlier rush of physical closeness. "You would do that for me?" He nodded, letting a wry smile curve his lips. "I'm already implicated, aren't I? If they find you, they'll find me. Might as well commit." He paused, more gently now. "And besides, I don't want anything to happen to you." Zersa's face softened at that admission. The tension coiled in her posture eased, and her eyes fluttered shut for the briefest moment, as if absorbing his words. Then she released a hushed breath and parted from him, stepping back into the corner of the cramped room. The absence of her body heat felt abrupt. "We should go. People will notice if we both vanish in the middle of the corridor." Rin nodded, though every nerve in him wanted to drag her close again, to taste the heat on her lips. But the weight of her situation pressed like a heavy cloak around them. He released the door lock, peering into the corridor. Empty. He motioned for her to follow, and together they slipped out, leaving that charged room behind. In the corridor's flickering neon light, the tension was less intimate, replaced by a shared sense of peril. Zersa tugged the hood of her cloak back over her head, masking her unique features from any prying eyes. They kept their distance from each other as they walked, as if afraid that any further show of closeness might betray too many secrets. Rin struggled to refocus, but the memory of her scaled fingers brushing his beard, the low catch of her breath, burned in his mind like a brand. He'd never felt such immediate magnetism before. Something about this alien woman enthralled him on a level he couldn't articulate. The starship groaned beneath them, the harsh overhead lights swinging as they passed compartments lined with battered metal walls. They sidestepped crates and stray bits of garbage the crew hadn't bothered to clear. This was a budget vessel, known to carry runaways, drifters, and wanderers. But even among that crowd, Zersa stood out. Even among all the misfits, she was singular. 2 deckhands trudged down the corridor, engaged in low conversation. Rin glanced at Zersa, noting how she pulled the brim of her hood lower over her face. He set his jaw and nodded casually to the deckhands, who ignored them and continued on. Relief eased the tension in his shoulders. They neared the starboard access lounge, where a battered console linked to the ship's internal systems. This area was usually deserted, except for the occasional off-shift pilot who needed a quiet corner. The lounge's lights flickered, half broken from months without maintenance. A stale smell of synthetic coffee lingered in the air. Perfect. No one was around. Rin gestured for Zersa to sit at a table by the far wall while he approached the console. She folded her arms beneath her cloak and sank into the shadow, watchful eyes never leaving him. He powered up the console with a crackle of static. The interface was slow, lines of code crawling across the flickering display. He typed in a few override commands he still remembered from his days as a freelance data jockey. A swirl of tension coalesced in his chest as he navigated into the passenger manifest. He scrolled through pages of names, scanning for anything that resembled Zersa. He found an entry under Zerxa, which seemed close enough to be an alias. Sure enough, the ID was flagged with a pass from a distant mining outpost, likely forged or purchased. "I see you," Rin murmured under his breath. "Let's see if we can bury you a bit deeper." His fingers danced over the keys, overriding basic security checks. The console beeped in protest a few times, but he persisted, weaving illusions in the code. Within a minute, the database read that the passenger, Zerxa, had disembarked at the last station. He exhaled, locking in the changes. That should buy them time. He turned to look at Zersa, who nodded gratefully from the shadows. "Done. As far as the official record goes, you're not on this ship." She rose and approached him quietly. "Thank you?" A faint smile tugged at his lips. "Well, let's just hope their security isn't top of the line." She caught the subtle quiver in his tone. "There's always risk," she said. "But you've reduced it." He'd expected relief or gratitude, but her expression was a complicated tapestry of both fear and longing. "We should lay low," he said, words feeling slightly hollow as adrenaline ebbed. "Keep to the corners of the ship until we dock." She stepped closer, eyes flicking to the corridor beyond the lounge. "We have 2 days, correct?" He nodded. "We make port at Astera station in roughly 48 hours. She fell silent, her focus drifting somewhere distant. He wondered about her life, about the horrors she'd seen or endured. The mention of captivity hung in his mind like a shadow. He wanted to know everything about her story and what had driven her to flee. But he also recognized the fragility of their new connection. Pushing might cause her to close off entirely. He led her back out into the corridor, heart thumping every time they passed a crew member. But nobody paid them much attention. This vessel was a labyrinth of uncaring metal corridors, each stretch identical to the last, scuffed floors and flickering overhead lights forming a constant, oppressive hum. The sense of being in a half-abandoned ghost ship weighed on him. He couldn't wait to reach Astera Station, the sprawling cosmic port rumored to house everything from black market merchants to exotic carnival markets. They found an out-of-the-way passage leading to storage compartments seldom used. Rin peeked into one, a small, box-filled space filled with mechanical parts and rations that smelled vaguely of salted fish. It was cramped, but it looked like a decent place to hole up if they needed total privacy. He guided Zersa inside, stepping over crates with caution. Dust motes danced in the stale glow of a single overhead lamp. Once they were sure they were alone, he let out a shaky breath. The tension between them was undeniable, but overshadowed by the constant thread humming in the background. She lowered her hood, allowing him a glimpse of her face once more. He fought the urge to draw near, to taste the warm air between them. Something in her expression told him she wanted the same, but uncertainty quivered in her eyes. "You risked your safety for me," she said at last, her voice hushed. "Why?" He had no simple answer. He thought of the lonely nights he'd spent drifting from station to station, the pang of seeing families reunited, lovers sharing a moment in a busy corridor, while he remained perpetually unanchored. Something in Xerxes' presence filled that hollow ache. "I couldn't not help," he replied honestly. "Not when you were right there, and I could do something." A faint color darkened the ridges on her cheeks, as if flush with heat. "I'm not used to kindness," she confessed. "Not from strangers." Rin let a smile slide across his lips. "Then maybe I'm not a stranger anymore." She studied him, and for a moment, the tension melted just enough to let them share a fragile sense of closeness. The overhead lamp buzzed, flickering in and out, giving the illusion that her scaled skin shimmered in waves of blue and black. He became hyper-aware of her proximity, the curve of her neck, the subtle flick of her silver hair. Her breathing sounded measured, but there was a slight hitch every few exhales, as if she was fighting some internal battle. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her tone guarded again. "Most humans I've met wanted something. Samples of my blood, the secrets of my healing ability, or the raw novelty of sleeping with an alien." The words fell from her mouth with a tense finality. He swallowed. "I won't deny I'm drawn to you," he said, choosing honesty over denial. "I can't pretend otherwise. But that doesn't mean I want to exploit you. I'm not like them. I only ask for the chance to help. If you'll let me." She closed her eyes, shoulders sagging in the dim space. "I want that. To trust you." She paused, voice cracking with vulnerability. "But every time I've let my guard down, it's ended in betrayal." Rin cautiously lifted a hand, letting it hover near hers, not daring to complete the contact unless she allowed it. "I'll prove I mean it," he said, breath catching. "Not with words. With actions." Her eyelids fluttered open. Slowly, she extended her hand, letting her scaled fingertips brush his. Warmth flared in Rin's chest at the subtle gesture. She entwined her fingers with his, an act both tender and heartbreakingly cautious. Her gaze flicked from their joined hands to his face. He squeezed gently, making no move to push her further than she was willing to go. The trust she offered, though faint, felt like a triumph. "We should rest," she said, exhaling. "At least for a little while. Then tomorrow, figure out how to handle the day before we land." He nodded, though the idea of sleeping felt impossible with so many things swirling in his head. "All right. I'll show you to one of the lesser-known crew bunks. It might be safer than the passenger quarters, now that your name's off the manifest." Without letting go of her hand, he guided her through the stack of crates. The corridor beyond was silent, the hum of the engine and the occasional beep of an overhead sensor the only company. They moved cautiously through the starship's labyrinth, mindful of each footstep. Eventually, they arrived at a narrow side passage that led to a series of unlabeled bunks. Most crew members crashed in the main living decks, so these were seldom used except in emergencies. Rin had discovered them by accident months ago. He led her to a small cabin at the end, opening the creaking door. The bunk inside was utilitarian, no comforts beyond a thin mattress and a single pillow. A faint overhead light flickered. At least it was private, with a locking mechanism on the inside. He stepped aside, letting her enter first. She glanced around the cramped space. "This will do," she murmured, sounding more resigned than comfortable. She set her small pack on the floor, the glow of the subspace locator device peeking through the fabric. Rin hesitated in the doorway. A part of him wanted to remain, to be near her, to hold her in his arms if she'd allow it. But he also sensed her need for space. "I'll be down the hall if you need me," he said softly. "I can keep watch. And if you ever need anything." Her gaze drifted to him, that complicated swirl of longing and fear still present. Then, in a soft motion, she reached out and tugged his collar again, a ghost of the earlier urgency. Her breath whispered across his lips. He nearly fell into that magnetic pull, heart thrumming. But after a tantalizing moment, she exhaled shakily and stepped back. "Thank you," she said. I need some rest." He nodded, swallowing a wave of disappointment tempered by understanding. "Of course. Sleep well, Zersa. She offered a reluctant nod. He slipped out, sealing the door behind him with a soft click. In the corridor, he leaned against the wall, exhaling slowly. His body still hummed from the memory of her touch. All of this was happening too fast and yet, in some strange way, felt inevitable. As if their paths had been careening toward each other all along. He checked his wrist device to see the ship's chronometer. 2,100 hours. He had time to do a quick recon, see if anyone was sniffing around looking for suspicious passengers. But even as he strolled away, his thoughts remained on Zersa's trembling hand against his face, the heat of her breath in that cramped utility room. Desire warred with protectiveness, tangling with curiosity. He wanted to learn everything about her, the shape of her desires, the color of her fears, the reason behind her half-choked confessions. For now, though, he had to ensure she remained undiscovered. He passed a few of the lounge areas, scanning the faces of the other passengers, a pair of miners from the Shek's belt complaining about wages, a group of starhoppers bragging about the best contraband on Astera station, an older man quietly asleep in a corner. Nobody seemed to pay him any attention. The captain and the first mate were up on the bridge, presumably. He saw no sign of a search party or enforcers. Maybe they were in the cargo hold, checking other leads. He told himself they had no reason to suspect a quiet, unassuming passenger. Not yet. His mind churned with plans and contingencies. If Zersa's pursuers had any presence on this ship, they'd likely remain discreet until the last moment. He needed to be ready for anything. But the tension in his gut was offset by a new warmth, a new sense of purpose. He couldn't deny that. For so long, he drifted aimlessly, a pilot for hire with no anchor. Now, for better or worse, he was tethered to this mysterious alien woman who had awakened something inside him he couldn't name. After circling the corridors for an hour, Rin returned to the deserted hallway near the hidden bunks. Nothing seemed out of place. He locked himself into the adjacent crew cabin, a near-identical space with a single bunk and harsh lighting. The door hissed shut behind him, isolating him from the rest of the world. He slumped onto the mattress. His mind wouldn't quiet. Visions of Zersa's luminous eyes filled the darkness behind his lids every time he blinked. The memory of her body, so close to his, beckoned like a half-forgotten dream. He stripped off his jacket and boots, letting them drop to the floor. The metal walls pressed in on him, a claustrophobic reminder of life in the black. Part of him yearned for the freedom of open skies, even though such a thing existed only on a handful of terraformed planets he'd visited. Another part of him yearned for something else entirely, the gentle exhale of a woman who touched his beard like it was a forbidden fruit, and the look in her eyes that said she was both terrified and tempted. Sleep was fitful. Images of pursuit blended with half-lucid dreams, flickers of Zersa's scaled skin shimmering in starlight, her expression torn between desire and fear, the hum of sublight engines drowning out her whispers. He woke repeatedly, heart pounding, uncertain of how much time had passed. The chronometer read 0400 hours. Eventually he dozed again, lulled by the hum of the ship and the lingering spice of her scent still on his jacket collar. At some point, a faint alarm echoed through the corridor, maybe an engine status notification, maybe something else. He jerked awake, body tense. But the alarm subsided quickly, replaced by the usual ambience. Faint footsteps passed by his door. He held his breath, hoping no one would decide to check the bunk. But they moved on, disappearing down the hall. He exhaled. The adrenaline spike left him restless. He decided to check on Zersa, though caution told him not to barge in on her cabin uninvited. The ship's chronometer crept toward morning, or what passed for morning in the vacuum of space. He rubbed his face, feeling the roughness of his beard. That memory of her scaled touch on his chin flared again, stirring an odd mixture of tenderness and raw hunger. Pushing aside the sensation, he exited the bunk, stepping into the hallway. He paused at her door, leaning close enough to listen. No sound emerged. Should he knock? The question warred in his mind. Ultimately, he tapped lightly, a gentle rap. No response came. Another wave of concern tightened his chest. He tried the door, found it locked. "Zersa?" he whispered softly. Silence. A pang of worry stabbed him. What if she'd been found? Or worse, what if she'd run off? He was about to override the lock when it hissed open from the inside. She stood there, hood drawn but face partially exposed. Relief flooded him at the sight of her. She looked tired, eyes shadowed, but she was alive and alone. "Sorry," she murmured, stepping aside to let him enter. "I was in a half-sleep. I heard you, but I hesitated." He slipped inside, sealing the door behind him. The cabin was just as cramped as before. The overhead light flickered, casting shifting shadows on her face. She pushed back the hood, revealing her dark, scaled skin and silver hair. Fatigue etched her features, but there was also a faint flicker of calm. "You okay?" he asked gently. She nodded. "No disturbances. I slept in short bursts, but better than I have in days." Then she offered the barest hint of a smile. "Thanks to you. If you hadn't erased my name, I'm sure they would have come for me by now." He stepped closer, resisting the urge to reach for her too quickly. "Are you hungry?" She paused, as if measuring her body's needs. "A little. I have some rations, but they taste off." He chuckled lightly. "Yeah, the standard stuff is basically nutrient paste. Let's head to the galley. Try to act casual. We can get better food there." She seemed reluctant to leave the security of the locked cabin, but after a moment she nodded. They made their way through the hall. The starship's artificial day cycle bathed the corridors in a slightly brighter light. Some of the passengers were stirring, going about their routines, searching for coffee or a place to doze away the monotony of travel. Rin walked beside Zersa, maintaining a comfortable distance, as if they barely knew each other. He didn't want to draw attention. Yet an electric awareness crackled between them, an undercurrent of tension that refused to disappear. Every so often, her hand brushed against his, and he felt that spark again. They reached the galley, a cramped space lined with humming dispensers. A few tables were bolted to the floor. A couple of passengers sipped coffee, ignoring them. Ren motioned for her to approach the dispenser, letting her select the best option from the bland array. She chose something labeled spice grain porridge, and he snagged a protein bar for himself. They found a corner table to sit at, half shrouded from the rest of the galley by a flickering overhead light. "So, do you plan to keep running once we reach Astera station?" he asked quietly. She stirred her porridge, eyes lowered. "Yes. I can't stay in one place. Not until I find a way to sever the locator's signal permanently." She glanced up, searching his face. "I never expected to get this far alone. Most of my people." He noticed the way her voice caught. "Did you escape with anyone?" Her gaze dropped again. "No. There were others in captivity, but when the chance came, I was the only one who managed to flee. They likely recaptured the rest." He heard the guilt in her tone. His chest tightened. "You did what you had to do." She nodded, but her eyes were haunted. "They want to harvest us. Our blood has regenerative properties. They use it in treatments for the wealthy and powerful. My species was once proud, with our own traditions, cities made of living crystal that gleamed under our planet's triple suns." Her voice broke slightly, and Rin's heart clenched at the pain beneath her words. "But once word spread of our blood's value, they came with warships. My people were unprepared. Our leaders struck deals to avoid genocide, deals that stripped us of our freedom." Rin set his protein bar aside, appetite lost. "I'm so sorry." She swallowed, forcing a levelness into her tone. "I refuse to be a commodity. That's why I fled." A wave of empathy and anger surged through him. He wanted to promise her vengeance, to tear down every slaver or corporation that dared imprison her people. But he had no illusions about his power. He was a single man, drifting from job to job. "I'll help however I can," he said instead, voice quiet but resolute. She studied him. "Why, Rin? You barely know me." He considered the question, searching himself for an answer that made sense. "I'm not sure," he admitted. Maybe I've spent too long not caring about anything. Seeing you fight so hard for your freedom. Maybe it reminded me that I can do more than just drift. She reached across the table, brushing her scaled fingertips over his knuckles. Her touch sent a jolt up his arm. Thank you. Even if this ends badly, I'm glad I met you. He curled his hand around hers, matching her gesture with equal gentleness. For a moment, they forgot the stale taste of synthetic food, the hum of the starship, the suspicious glances of a passenger who might be half watching them. In that contact, Rin felt a surge of something far beyond mere attraction. It was a stirring sense of purpose, maybe even hope. They finished eating in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Rin disposed of their trays while Zersa lingered near the exit. When they slipped back into the corridor, they nearly bumped into a tall, imposing figure dressed in dark leathers, a heavy rifle slung across his back. The man gave them a sweeping glance, eyes narrowing at Zersa's partially shrouded face. Rin tensed, mind racing. This man looked like a hired merc, the kind unscrupulous captains employed for security. The barrel of his rifle was scuffed, well used. He was definitely no ordinary passenger. The man's gaze flicked between Rin and Zersa, perhaps noticing the unusual tilt of her hood, or the faint glimmer of her skin. Rin forced a casual smirk and stepped aside. "Morning," he said in a voice that he hoped sounded bored. The merc grunted, scanning them a moment longer. Then he moved on, heavy boots echoing on the metal floor. Rin felt Zersa's tension in the subtle shake of her hand. He ushered her away, heart pounding. "We need to be careful," he muttered under his breath. She nodded, pulling the hood tighter. He didn't seem convinced we were just random passengers. "No," Rin exhaled. "Let's head back to the private cabins. I'll watch for any signs of trouble." They moved quickly, slipping through side corridors. Zersa matched his pace, her steps lithe and near silent. Rin marveled at how graceful she was, even in the cramped ship. She had a fluidity that reminded him of large felines he'd once seen in a distant colony's nature preserve. But he sensed that same primal tension, a readiness to fight or flee at any moment. When they reached Zersa's hidden bunk, Rin frowned. "We shouldn't split up," he said, surprising himself with his own words. "If trouble comes, you'll need someone to watch your back." She hesitated at the threshold. "Then stay," she offered, voice soft but resolute. His heart thudded. He glanced at the cramped interior. There was barely enough room for one person to move comfortably, let alone two. But the alternative was for them to remain separated, vulnerable to whomever that merc might be working for. "All right," he said, stepping inside. She locked the door behind them, sealing them into that small space once more. The tension, that unspoken current, crackled back to life as if it had never left. He settled on the edge of the bunk, and she sat beside him, their thighs almost touching. The closeness made the air feel charged with 100 possible confessions. "I'm not used to this," she admitted, voice trembling. "Sharing a space with someone who isn't my enemy." Rin's throat went dry. "I'll try to prove worthy of the trust you're giving me." Her gaze flicked to him, gold eyes seeming to peel away layers of pretense. Slowly, she raised her hand and trailed her fingertips across his beard again, a deliberate echo of the moment that had first drawn them together. He found himself leaning into her touch, exhaling a ragged breath. The tension throbbed between them, so palpable it felt alive. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, eyelashes fluttering. "But I feel—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I feel hungry for connection. It's been so long since I've let myself feel anything but fear." He almost laughed at the intensity of relief and desire swirling in his chest. Instead, he lifted a trembling hand to rest against her cheek. Her skin was unexpectedly warm, with a faint texture that sent sparks through his fingertips. "We can figure it out together," he said, voice low. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. Her lips parted, breath hitching, and for a moment he thought she would bridge the gap between them. His own heart hammered so hard he was certain she could feel it through the air. Then, with a soft, tentative motion, she pressed her mouth to his. The contact was electric, his senses overwhelmed by the warmth and the slightly sweet taste of her lips. Her scales grazed the corner of his jaw, sending shivers that mingled pleasure with something new and thrilling. She let out a small, wavering sound that ignited a deeper hunger in him. He slid his hand around her waist, pulling her closer, feeling the slim curves of her body beneath the coarse fabric of her cloak. The kiss deepened, slow at first, exploration tinted with uncertainty and wonder. Her hands slid up his chest, nails, were they nails or tiny claw tips, scraping lightly through the material of his shirt. The sensation caused a jolt of heat to surge through his veins. He realized he was breathing hard, as if they'd sprinted a mile. A dull roaring in his ears drowned out the hum of the ship. But in the midst of that growing closeness, a small voice reminded him of their precarious situation. Anyone could discover them, mercenaries could be prowling the halls, and they were locked in a tiny room with no easy escape route. Reluctantly, he pulled back, chest rising and falling as he tried to calm his pounding heart. "We should be careful," he whispered against her lips, both an admission and a plea to some unknown force. Her eyes fluttered open, dark pupils wide with shared desire. She swallowed, a faint color tinging her cheeks. "I know. But I don't want to stop." A wave of conflicting emotions rolled through him, longing, protectiveness, excitement, fear. He brushed a thumb across her lower lip, feeling the slight ridge there, admiring how alien and yet so heartbreakingly human she seemed. "We won't stop," he promised softly. "But we'll be smart. Let's take a moment. Listen to see if the halls are clear. We can't just lose ourselves and become easy prey." She nodded, drawing in a steadying breath. Slowly, she extricated herself from the tangle of arms and turned to press her ear to the cabin door. Rin held his breath, straining to hear anything through the thin metal. A faint hum, a distant clank of crates, nothing else. The corridor seemed quiet. He rose, swallowing the knot in his throat. "Let's do a quick perimeter check," he said. "Then we'll figure out how to spend the rest of the day without drawing suspicion." She nodded, cheeks still faintly flushed. He unlocked the door and slipped into the corridor with her in tow. Together, they moved with shared caution, checking corners and listening for footsteps. They glimpsed the tall merc again near the crew lounge, conversing with an off-duty pilot. The man's posture radiated suspicion, eyes scanning the ship's interior with predatory intent. Rin and Zersa ducked behind a junction, waiting until the merc moved on. It felt like a cat-and-mouse game. Their hearts hammered with each near encounter. Yet, ironically, the tension only heightened their awareness of each other, as if the brush of their shoulders or the accidental meeting of their hands conveyed a silent pact to protect each other at all costs. They retreated to the unoccupied cargo hold, a wide, dusty space strewn with crates of dried goods, machinery parts, and sealed oxygen tanks. Here, at least, they could speak more freely. The overhead lights were dim, leaving long shadows for them to hide in. Rin leaned against a tall crate, exhaling. "We've got to assume he's looking for you. No one else here warrants that level of interest." She nodded. "He may have been hired by those who want me captured. Or he could be an independent bounty hunter, paid for any leads. So we can't afford to get caught with our guard down," Rin said, raking his fingers through his hair. "We have to stay one step ahead until we reach Astera Station. Once we're there, we can blend in with the crowds, or find a way to cloak your signal." She approached him, quiet urgency in her eyes. "There's a powerful black market dealer on Astera who's rumored to have advanced biotech. If I can get her to remove or block the subspace locator embedded in my body, I might finally be free." Her voice caught on the last word, as if the concept was both thrilling and terrifying. He nodded, scanning her expression. "We'll find her. We'll do whatever it takes." Her gaze dropped, and she traced the edge of the crate with a finger. "I'll need credits. Likely more than I have. These black market deals aren't cheap." He considered that. "I have some saved up. Not a fortune, but enough to buy a few favors on Astera." She looked up, eyes shimmering with cautious hope. "I can't ask you to." "You're not asking," he interjected. "I'm offering." She pressed her lips together, struggling with her emotions. I'll repay you somehow. He reached out and gently tilted her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. You already have. By letting me help, by letting me in. I haven't had a purpose in a long time. She swallowed, the sincerity in his tone seeming to pierce her defenses. Then, as if a wave of emotion overcame her, she closed the distance between them, resting her forehead against his shoulder. His arms slid around her, pulling her close. He could feel the faint tremor in her frame, an echo of suppressed fear and longing. She nuzzled her face into the crook of his neck, her soft exhalation sending a tingle down his spine. They stayed like that for a few moments, exchanging warmth and the subtle comfort of shared breath. Finally, she pulled back, an unspoken apology in her eyes for letting her guard slip so freely. Rin brushed a stray tendril of silver hair from her brow, smiling softly. We'll make it, he said, quiet conviction in every syllable. She nodded, taking a slow breath. We should stay here for a bit, stay off the Merc's radar. He agreed. They took to the shadows, finding a secluded spot between stacks of crates. The cargo hold was silent except for the soft hum of life support systems. From their vantage point, they could watch the main entrance. If the Merc or anyone else came by, they'd have time to hide properly or make a quick escape. Settling down, Rin leaned against the crate, Zersa beside him. She tucked her cloak around her, and they lapsed into a comfortable silence, occasionally whispering about small details. How best to avoid cameras, which corridors offered fewer patrols. Their practical discussion was undercut by the palpable awareness that pressed them closer together. Each brush of her scales against his forearm sent little jolts of electricity up his spine. He found himself studying the color variations on her face, from the deep navy near her temples to the faint aquamarine patterning that trailed down her jawline. She noticed his gaze and lowered her eyes, as if self-conscious, yet she didn't move away. Time passed slowly in that quiet vigil. The cargo hold's lighting cast shifting patterns on the floor as the ship adjusted power levels, and the distant drone of engines lulled them into a half-dreamy state. Despite the tension of being hunted, Rin felt oddly at peace sitting with her. It was as if the constant swirl of his chaotic life had found a brief moment of calm. At one point she let her head rest against his shoulder. He dared to slip an arm around her, and she didn't resist. They said little, content in the hush of shared presence. Some primal part of him wanted to claim her, to protect her from the entire universe, to feel her body pressed against his in the fullness of whatever union they could find. But he knew that pushing too quickly would shatter the tenuous trust they built. So he let the moment linger, letting the rhythms of their breath harmonize in the lonely cargo bay. Hours seemed to bleed together. They dozed in shifts, one watching the door while the other caught bits of sleep. At some point, Zersa leaned over and pressed a whispery kiss to his cheek, as though silently thanking him for his vigilance. He managed a tired smile, brushing a thumb across her lips, amazed at how quickly things had changed. 2 days ago, they'd been strangers passing each other in a corridor. Now, each heartbeat felt intertwined with hers. Eventually, hunger drove them out of hiding. They snuck back to the galley during an off-peak hour, avoiding the Merc and any prying eyes. They ate more bland rations, exchanging glances that conveyed their weariness. The remainder of the day passed in a similar dance of caution. Rin checked the passenger logs again to see if any new suspicion had been flagged. So far, they remained clear. The second day aboard dawned with an announcement over the ship's intercom. They would arrive at Astera station by late evening. Relief and anxiety surged in equal measure. Zersa avoided the main decks altogether, and Rin took the risk of roaming about just enough to overhear passenger gossip. The Merc was still aboard, occasionally asking vague questions about unusual passengers, but no one seemed to have named Zersa outright. Time crawled forward, each hour a marathon of tension. They reconvened in her cabin around midday, sharing meager food and small, comforting touches in the secrecy of that cramped space. I can't believe I'm almost there, she said, voice tight with anticipation. Almost free. Rin studied her face, his chest tightening. Once we dock, I'll stay with you as long as you want me to. She offered a small, sad smile. I'd like that. But I don't want to drag you into my mess. He brushed a thumb over her cheek, her skin silky and warm under his touch. It's not your mess alone anymore. We're in this together. Her gaze flickered. When we set foot on Astera, we could easily lose each other in the crowd. Maybe you'd be safer if... I'm not leaving you alone, he interrupted gently. So stop trying to protect me. She let out a shaky breath, pressing her forehead to his. They lingered in that near kiss, the vibrations of the starship's engines reverberating underfoot. Finally, she sank onto the bunk, pulling Rin down with her. They lay there in a cocoon of closeness, the overhead light flickering. Nothing about their situation was certain, but for that brief moment, their hearts beat in sync, forging an unspoken promise. They dozed off in each other's arms, letting the hum of traveling through space lull them into a respite from relentless caution. A loud clang jolted them awake. Rin bolted upright, heart hammering. Zersa's eyes flew open, glowing faintly in the dimness. Another clang echoed through the corridors, followed by a series of heavy footsteps. Shouts drifted through the metal walls. Rin and Zersa exchanged alarmed looks. Something was happening. Possibly the Merc, or a search party. Maybe both. Rin motioned for her to stay quiet. He eased off the bunk and crept to the door, pressing his ear to the metal. Footsteps thundered past, accompanied by the low hum of a plasma rifle charging. Anxiety spiked in his gut. He gestured for Zersa to gather her belongings, every sense on high alert. The cabin felt claustrophobic, each breath echoing in Rin's ears. Suddenly, the ship's intercom crackled to life. All passengers remain in your quarters. We have a security breach. Repeat, security breach. Lockdown in progress. A curse slipped from Rin's lips. Lockdown meant sealed doors and restricted movement. If the Merc had triggered this, it was likely because he was closing in on Zersa. Rin tried to open the door, but it locked with a sharp beep. Panic flashed across Zersa's features. They were trapped in this tiny bunk room, with no immediate exit. If security or the Merc forced the door, they'd be sitting targets. Think, Rin told himself, scanning the cramped cabin for a solution. The overhead vent? The ship's design might allow them to crawl through maintenance ducts if they could pry it open. He reached up and tested the vent cover. It was bolted tight, but with enough force or a tool, they might break it. Zersa stood on the bunk, adding her strength as well. Together, they managed to loosen one bolt, then another, working quickly, their hearts hammering. Each moment stretched, each clang in the hallway terrifyingly loud. Finally, the vent cover popped free. Rin hoisted himself up, then helped Zersa up behind him. The duct was cramped, forcing them to shuffle on hands and knees. He pulled the vent cover back into place as best he could from the inside. Darkness enveloped them. The duct air was stale, hot. They crawled in silence, careful not to make any noise that might alert whoever was in the corridors. Every so often, the metal beneath them rattled with the ship's movement, or they'd pass a grated vent that peered into a hallway or another cabin. Rin's arms and knees ached, but he pressed on, guided only by the faint glow of Zersa's eyes or the dim emergency lights that seeped through some of the vents. They passed over what sounded like a confrontation. Harsh voices shouted, accompanied by the distinctive whine of a weapon firing. Rin paused, glancing through a narrow slat. Below, the tall Merc from earlier was crouched behind a corner, exchanging fire with a pair of security drones. Smoke curled from the rifle's muzzle. A deck plate sparked. The drones hovered, returning blasts of pulsing blue energy that scorched the walls. The Merc bellowed in frustration. She's on this ship, damn it! Hand her over! Rin stiffened. He exchanged a glance with Zersa, whose expression was grim. They crawled away from the chaos, hearts thundering. It confirmed the worst. The Merc was actively hunting for her. Possibly the rest of the crew was caught in the crossfire. They continued through the duct network until they reached an offshoot that seemed to slope downward. Rin guessed it led to the cargo hold or engineering deck. He tried to recall the ship's schematic he'd once seen. The cargo hold was near the main airlock, which might be sealed during lockdown. But engineering had maintenance hatches that could lead to an escape pod or some auxiliary exit. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Xerxes' breath came in shallow bursts, her anxiety palpable. She kept her gaze focused ahead, refusing to give in to fear. Eventually, they found a vent that opened onto a dim corridor near engineering. Rin quietly dislodged the cover, peered out, and saw no one. He dropped down, then helped her down. The hallway was lit only by emergency lights, casting everything in a red haze. An alarm beeped in the distance, warning of a hull breach or weapon discharge. Rin led the way, careful to keep a hand on his sidearm, a battered energy pistol he'd concealed in his boot. Xerxes clutched her cloak around her, scanning for threats. They navigated twisting corridors until they reached a sealed bulkhead door. A keypad flickered with an error message: lockdown in progress, no access. Rin cursed under his breath. He tried a manual override, but the system was locked with a level of security he wasn't sure he could bypass in time. Footsteps echoed from behind. Rin spun, heart jumping. In a flash, Xerxes pressed herself against the wall, hand drifting toward a small blade at her waist. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by labored breathing. A figure stumbled around the corner, a crew member, a mechanic by the look of his oil-stained jumpsuit. He froze upon seeing them, eyes wide. Rin raised a hand in a placating gesture, though he kept his pistol ready. "Hey," he whispered. "We're not your enemies." The mechanic swallowed, sweat streaming down his face. "There's a man with a rifle storming around, shooting drones, demanding to find some stowaway. Security's holed up trying to contain him, but half the doors are jammed." Rin nodded. "We're just trying to get to the engineering bay to see if we can shut this lockdown down." The mechanic eyed them warily. Then he exhaled, running a shaky hand through his hair. "Good luck. The main route is blocked. I was trying to escape this madness." His gaze flicked to Xerxes, as though noticing her unusual appearance. His eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Wait, you're—" Before he could finish the accusation, Xerxes stepped forward, voice trembling with an edge of desperation. "Please, just let us pass. We don't want trouble." The mechanic's expression darkened. "He's after you, isn't he?" He took a step back, as if deciding whether to sound an alarm. But fear warred with pity in his eyes. Rin seized the opportunity. "Look, I'll pay you. Just show us another way through this door or a bypass to get to engineering. Then you can go." He fiddled in his pocket, pulling out a few credit chips. The mechanic hesitated, eyes darting between them and the corridor behind. Then, with a resigned sigh, he snatched the chips. "All right. There's a manual override panel behind that maintenance plate." He pointed to a small hatch in the wall. "Open it, cut the green wire, and it'll short the lock for a moment." Rin nodded. "Thank you." The mechanic wiped sweat from his brow. "I didn't see you," he muttered, turning to stumble away in the opposite direction. Wasting no time, Rin pried off the maintenance plate, exposing a tangle of wires. Xerxes helped guide him by the dim red light. They found the green wire, severed it, and the bulkhead door hissed open an inch. Rin pulled it aside, letting them slip through before it shut again with a clang. Past the door, the corridor led to the engineering bay, where the hum of the starship's main reactor thrummed through the floor. The air was warmer here, thick with the scent of engine coolant and burning metal. They crept forward until they found themselves in a large chamber lined with piping and console panels. Sparks flew from a damaged terminal in the corner. A single overhead light flickered. The roaring thunder of the reactor's core rattled the walls. Xerxes scanned the area. "We need to find a way to get off this ship," she said urgently. Rin's eyes flicked to the far end of the bay, where he spotted an auxiliary airlock. If they could bypass lockdown protocols, they might be able to open it. But they'd need a spacesuit or a docking arm to attach to the station. The station. If the starship was already near Astera's perimeter, they might be close enough to forcibly dock or at least hack a connection. He noticed an old docking interface at the side of the room. It looked half-broken, but maybe workable. Before he could move, the hiss of the bulkhead behind them parted. They spun, hearts in their throats. The tall merc entered, rifle raised, eyes wild with adrenaline. A fresh scorch mark marred his left shoulder plate, courtesy of the security drones. He locked onto Zersa with a triumphant sneer. "Finally found you," he growled. "Don't bother running." Rin positioned himself between Zersa and the merc, pistol drawn. "Back off," he barked. The merc merely chuckled, leveling his rifle. A standoff erupted, tension crackling in the charged air. Zersa stepped sideways, trying to angle herself behind some machinery. Her eyes glowed fiercely, a mixture of terror and defiance. The merc tracked her movement, finger hovering over the trigger. "They'll pay me a fortune for you," he said in a rasping voice. "Make this easy on yourself." Rin's heart hammered. The merc clearly had superior firepower, and they were pinned in an enclosed space. One shot from that rifle could end it all. But he refused to yield. Instead, he clenched his jaw. "You sure you want to risk a hull breach by firing that thing in here?" The merc sneered. "I'll do what I must. Hand her over or you both die." For a split second, the chaotic hum of the reactor was the only sound. Then Zersa drew a deep breath, eyes narrowing. "I'd rather die on my feet than be a prisoner," she spat, voice trembling but resolute. The merc's snarl deepened, and he lunged forward, intending to close the distance so Rin's pistol wouldn't matter as much. Rin fired a shot, the energy bolt slamming into the merc's thigh. He grunted, staggering, but kept moving with grim determination. A return shot lanced from his rifle, searing the air by Rin's head, narrowly missing. Rin ducked behind a console, adrenaline surging. Sparks erupted from a pipe overhead, raining hot debris. Zersa scrambled toward a cluster of pipes, trying to flank the merc. Rin popped up, fired 2 more shots, one deflected by the merc's armor, the other scorching his rifle's side. The merc howled and unleashed a rapid volley. Metal panels sparked, a conduit burst, and thick smoke billowed, obscuring the engineering bay in a haze of noxious fumes. Through the smoke, Rin heard Zersa coughing, heard the merc's boots grinding on the deck. Heart pounding, Rin maneuvered through the swirling veil, every sense on edge. A figure loomed out of the smoke, Zersa, eyes watering, staggering toward him. He grabbed her, guiding her behind a crate. She clutched her side, face twisted in pain. Rin's stomach lurched. "You hit?" She shook her head, wincing. "No, it's just..." She coughed, pressing a hand to her ribs. "Ricochet. I'm okay. We have to get out of here." Rin's mind raced. The auxiliary airlock was to their left, but the merc blocked the path. Another volley of rifle fire tore through the smoke, forcing them to flatten themselves against the floor. The ship shook, a klaxon screaming overhead. Possibly an engine malfunction from all the crossfire. They didn't have long before something catastrophic gave out. Rin guided Zersa across the deck, using every bit of cover they could find. The smoke was thick, stinging his eyes and throat. The overhead lights flickered, dancing shadows across the chaos. He spotted the airlock console just a few meters away, but it might as well have been an entire world. The merc's silhouette lurked behind the swirling haze, limping but still armed. Desperation took hold. Rin gripped Zersa's hand, his voice trembling with urgency. "When I say go, you run for that console. Try to override the lock. I'll keep him busy." Her eyes flashed fear. "No, I'll be fine," he lied, heart thudding. "We can't both be pinned here. Someone has to open that airlock." She glanced at the console, then back at him. The swirl of her emotions was painfully clear in her eyes. She didn't want to leave him. But they had no choice. "All right," she whispered, voice tight with resolve. Rin took a breath, steeling himself. Then he surged out from cover, firing wildly at the merc's position. 3 blasts cut through the haze, forcing the merc to duck behind piping. "Now!" Rin shouted, feeling his throat burn from the smoke. Zersa sprinted, cloak billowing behind her, toward the console. The merc emerged in fury, returning fire at Rin. One shot tore through Rin's shoulder, sending a jolt of searing pain down his arm. He hissed, nearly dropping his pistol, but he forced himself to keep firing. Each shot from the merc threatened to end him, scorching metal mere inches away. Across the bay, Zersa reached the console, slamming her palm against the controls. Rin could barely see her through the swirling smoke. Another shot seared over his head. He ducked behind a broken terminal, breathing ragged, shoulders screaming in agony. The merc bellowed, "I'll kill you both! This ship will be your tomb!" Rin grit his teeth, rising just enough to return fire. He caught a glimpse of the merc lurching forward, blood staining his thigh, rifle blazing. A round clipped the corner of the terminal, erupting in sparks that singed Rin's cheek. He cried out, vision swimming. Then, in the corner of his eye, he saw the console lights flash green. The airlock hissed, the sealed hatch opening a fraction. Zersa shouted, "Rin! It's open, but the pressure is unstable." We can't worry about that now, he thought, heart racing. He had to buy her a few more seconds. Summoning a burst of adrenaline, he vaulted over the terminal, firing one last volley at the merc. One shot caught the merc's rifle, shorting it out in a blaze of sparks. The merc roared in frustration, then hurled the weapon aside and lunged for Rin with a fierce punch. Rin barely dodged, his injured shoulder flaring in pain. The merc's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling. Dazed, Rin tasted blood. The merc towered over him, pulling a wicked-looking knife from his belt. Zersa screamed from across the bay. She hurtled forward in a blur of motion, launching herself at the merc. Her scaled hand raked across his face, drawing lines of crimson. He roared, swinging the knife in a wide arc. She dodged, but the blade caught her arm, opening a shallow gash. She hissed in pain. Rin, struggling to regain his bearings, rolled to the side, searching for his dropped pistol. He spotted it inches away, half buried by debris. The merc struck Zersa again, forcing her back. Rin managed to grab his pistol, aiming with trembling hands. He fired. The blast nailed the merc in the side, staggering him. Zersa capitalized on the opening, driving a swift kick into his chest. He crashed backward with a guttural choke, sliding across the deck. Blood pooled beneath him, a painful rattle in his throat. Rin scrambled to his feet, clutching his wounded shoulder, and limped to Zersa's side. She was breathing hard, adrenaline coursing through her. They eyed the fallen merc. He coughed, trying to raise his knife one last time, but the effort failed. His eyes burned with hatred. "You won't escape," he growled, voice wet with blood. Then the flicker of life left his gaze. His hand fell limp. A pounding ache throbbed in Rin's shoulder, but relief that the threat was over swept through him. Zersa trembled, staring at the merc's body, then at Rin. "You're bleeding," she said, voice ragged. "So are you." He stepped forward, checking the wound on her arm. It wasn't too deep, but it bled freely. She hissed when he applied pressure. The overhead lights strobed, an alarm blaring again. They needed to get out fast. The airlock stood partially open, hissing with the pressurization sequence. Rin limped over, checking the console. The readout indicated an incomplete docking procedure with Astera Station. They were close enough to attempt a forced latch, but it wasn't guaranteed to hold. He glanced at Zersa, who fought back tears of pain. "We have to try," he said, voice grim. She nodded. Her eyes gleamed with fresh resolve. Together, they manipulated the controls, ignoring the stabs of pain from their wounds. A warning flashed. "External lock incomplete. Atmospheric seal unstable." Rin cursed, glancing up at the overhead display. If they opened the airlock now, they risked a partial vacuum. But waiting might mean more security forces or other mercenaries closing in. "We've come this far," Zersa said, jaw set. "I won't be captured." Rin met her gaze, heart pounding. "Me either." He adjusted the controls. "We'll open it manually and hope we can seal the coupling with Astera's side. If it fails, well..." She nodded, finishing his thought. If it failed, they'd be sucked into the void. Rin hit the override. The hatch hissed, opening in increments, the air around them swirling. They ducked inside the small, cramped chamber, where a second door led to the station's docking port. A wailing alert signaled the unstable seal. Rin overrode that too, ignoring the system's protests. With a final beep, the outer door parted, revealing a short tunnel half attached to the station's airlock. Through the transparent panel, Rin could see the glow of Astera's docking ring. The alignment was off by a few meters, forcing the ship's docking clamp at an awkward angle. They'd have to jump the gap in zero gravity. Xerxes' eyes widened. "We can do this," she said, as much to convince herself as him. He offered a faint grin. "Just like stepping across a tiny chasm, in space." She took his hand, bracing herself. Together, they edged to the lip of the forced connection. The vacuum's pull held around them, though the partial seal prevented immediate decompression. Without overthinking it, they leaped. For a terrifying heartbeat, they floated in open space, twisting as the gravity shifted. Rin's stomach lurched, but he focused on the station's airlock, hooking an arm around a stray handhold. Xerxes clung to his waist, her nails digging into his side. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the searing pain from his shoulder. Slowly, awkwardly, they maneuvered themselves until they were pressed against the station's hatch. By some stroke of luck or alignment, the station's side recognized the emergency docking attempt. The hatch beeped and slid open. They tumbled inside, landing on a grated floor in a heap of limbs. The door sealed behind them, shutting out the vacuum. A wave of pressurized air rushed in, nearly knocking the breath from their lungs. They lay there, panting, hearts thundering. Finally, they were on Astera station, battered but alive. As they caught their breath, Xerxes let out a trembling laugh that bordered on hysteria. "We made it," she whispered. Rin leaned his head back against the wall, blinking away spots in his vision. "Yeah, somehow." She turned to him, her face drawn with pain, but her eyes alight with triumph. Blood stained her torn sleeve, and Rin felt his own injury throbbing in time with his racing pulse. Yet none of it could overshadow the relief coursing through them. They had escaped the starship. They'd survived the murk. And now, an entire space station sprawled before them, offering both danger and possibility. Rin swallowed hard, meeting her gaze. She wore a shaky, grateful smile, and without words she leaned in, pressing her lips to his in a brief, desperate kiss. He inhaled her scent, that mixture of alien spice and sweat, and something uniquely hers. She pulled back, eyes shining. He managed a weak grin. "We're not safe yet," he murmured. "But at least we have a fighting chance." She nodded, forcing herself upright despite the grimace of pain. "We need to find that black market dealer," she said, eyes narrowing with renewed determination. "We need to get this locator out of me." He carefully stood, offering her a hand. "Let's patch ourselves up first," he suggested. "Then we'll dive into the underbelly of Astera." She squeezed his hand, the promise of freedom fueling them. Together, they limped down the corridor, stepping into the shadowy confines of Astera Station, where neon lights glowed in the distance, and the hum of 1,000 illicit deals formed the pulse of this frontier outpost. Although battered and wounded, they pressed on side by side, tethered by desperation and a bond they could no longer deny, ready to face whatever lay beyond these walls.